Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on communication. A lot of people struggle with communicating with a high conflict ex. It's not something that's new to me, but it is something that I haven't been able to do a video on because it is one of those things that has so many nuances and edge cases and corner cases, and um, there's no really simple formulaic solution to the problem, solution to how to communicate with a high conflict ex. Sometimes I call it threading the needle, because it's just so difficult to respond in the exact way that the response needs to be without being baited into an argument or sucked into some kind of like accusatory response and something like that. It's extremely difficult to get it just right, and unfortunately, if you don't get it just right, with most judges you will suffer the consequences, because most judges they don't have the patience to really try and get to the bottom of high conflict personality disordered or emotionally immature exes. They just typically will just blame it on both parents. I talk about this in the video, two bad parents. And then you combine that with the problem that most judges just see their job as a paycheck. Family judges especially just hate their job for the most part. There's very few that are really great judges. The lion's share of them are either incompetent or they just don't care. And I talk about that in the video, good judge, bad judge. And so much of what ends up getting thrown up in court is the communications. It's the messages, it's the emails, it's the texts. And so I've gotten so many comments on this and so many emails on it, and I think I'm ready to do a video on it. All I can really do is give people little bits and pieces of what I figured out when it came to my case, and when it came to sort of getting into the details of a few other people's cases, typically viewers, sometimes friends. I noticed the same patterns. I didn't see anything different. It wasn't like each of these high conflict exes had different techniques, or they all did the same thing. It was just a question of how often each ex would use a certain technique, because there are quite a few techniques that these high conflict exes use. I just want to stop and mention this video isn't for people who are not in a case against a high conflict ex. This is not a great video for just ordinary communications with a person who communicates in good faith. If you're dealing with an ex who you just can't agree with you for just ordinary reasons, they're just upset at the divorce or the child custody dispute, but they're a reasonable person, I wouldn't recommend using this video. I'd recommend trying to get through to them. Over time, you'll probably be able to at least make some headway. I also don't recommend this for people who are dealing with a high conflict ex that are not in court. If you're not in court, just stop talking to them, period. Don't gray rock, just flat out discontinue all communication with that person. There is no reason to communicate with a high conflict person unless you're forced to. And the court system will force you to do it, because when it comes to co-parenting, you have to communicate. Otherwise, you might be the one that the court deems non-cooperative or high conflict. I also want to clarify my definition of high conflict, because sometimes people just assume it's just two people who just can't get along. It's not what it is, in my opinion. I'm sorry. In my opinion, what I mean to say is by the definition that the channel uses, because those are just two dictionary words, high conflict. The meaning behind them is in the dictionary. I can't act like I can give it a special meaning, but I can act like within the context of my channel, those words have special meaning. And so the special meaning that I attribute to high conflict in this channel, I've stated before a couple of times, is basically a person who is obsessed with the conflict and has attached some sort of portion or even the entirety of their identity to the conflict. In other words, for them, the end of the conflict is a threat to their existence, as to the sort of person that they define themselves as. These people have typically set themselves up in this role of either sort of David versus Goliath, and they're not going to stop fighting until they win, or this sort of role of I don't know, like a delusional hero. Like they think they're this hero in a story almost. That's kind of, most of the people that do this, they either have severe emotional immaturity issues or they have a personality disorder. And so it's not just that they don't want to, it's that if the conflict ends, they sort of lose their sense of self. This is something that I've noticed when it comes to these high conflict exes. They're not that common, but when you encounter them, they're like a tornado. When it comes to how they treat the child, the abuse and neglect that they commit on the child, because they become so attached to this idea of who they are in this insane conflict in the court system that they lose all ability to really pay attention to what they're supposed to, which is what the child needs. Everything is looked at through the lens of the conflict, how to maintain the conflict, and sort of how to capitalize on it, whether they're garnering narcissistic supply from their friends and family that they're talking about the conflict to, or even their target, which is the other parent, or whether it's just sort of to get sympathy, to just sort of get you're such a poor you. I can't believe you're having to go through this. Sometimes just to get that oh, you're such a great parent. It's great that you're fighting for. Anyway, all these various different um, messed up psychological reasons as to why a parent is high conflict. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about high conflict. Other situations where there's just conflict in a case, it can go away over time. The two sides can just work things out, figure it out, and the conflict can just go away after a couple of years because both sides genuinely want it to end. And when both sides want it to end, over time, it will end. Each side will slowly but surely move to a good middle ground that both sides think is fair. And even if they don't think it's fair, there's so many other things in their life that they've decided they care about more, so they just stop really caring about it and they just let it go. Whereas with a high conflict ex, because of their mental health issues or their emotional immaturity issues, they just can't let it go because it's like it's the end of themselves as they know it. For them, it's very different. So anyway, that being said, I'm going to go through some of the little bits and pieces that I used. I didn't really figure a lot of these out until around year 5. So from years 1 through 5, I was just doing all the wrong things and responding to all the messages and just getting sucked into all the arguments. And around year 5, I really started to decide that I needed to communicate in a way that basically put me in the best possible position to win whatever hearing I needed to win. And so all of my communication was designed in a way that wasn't focused on actually getting the other side to sort of come to an agreement, because I realized by year 5 the other side had mental health issues and they couldn't agree because their mental health issues were getting in the way of it. So what I needed to do was communicate in a way that the court would understand and that the court would find acceptable and that the court would use as a basis or a reason to justify ruling in my favor. What I have begun to tell some parents is that you need to think of yourself as everything that you do is going into a factual background of emotion. Everything that you say and text and email and put in our family wizard is going to be an exhibit in emotion. And that's all that matters, because anything above and beyond that is just going to be exploited by the high conflict ex. So as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned this, it's like threading a needle. You have to get it just right. You have to respond just enough that your opponent and the court won't see you that your opponent won't characterize you as, and that the court won't see you as a non-cooperative parent or a high conflict parent, because that does happen, but not so much that it gives the high conflict ex all kinds of things to latch onto and sort of just keep the either spark up an argument or just keep an existing argument just going round and round and round in circles. There have been people who've gone back and forth 100 replies because the normal parent just doesn't understand that there's nothing that they can say to get it through the high conflict parent's thick skull. There's nothing that they can say. There's no reason. There's no logic. There's nothing that can be done. Because for 2 reasons: the high conflict ex doesn't want it to be over, and also because the high conflict ex is often looking for some kind of specific response. And I'll go into that in a bit. Sorry. So the first thing, I guess I'm going to start with some of the simple. I can't really show examples because I don't think it's right to share people's communications on a video. It would be nice to have examples, but maybe I might do that later if I create a new series on communication. I don't know. Something like that wouldn't be something that happens anytime soon, but I'm going to just try and go over some of the, I guess I could call it doctrines, ideas, doctrines, I don't know, plans, whatever, that I came up with over time. and hopefully my viewers can make use of it. So the first, which is the most simplest, is not responding every time you get a message. I eventually, after a few years, after 5 years, I came up with this 1 hour, 7 hour, 1 day rule. So the first response that I get, I try to respond within the hour. The next response that I get, I would wait until at least 7 hours later. Oftentimes there would be 2 or 3 responses waiting, and I would just wait until about 7 hours and respond to all of them. And then after that, if I got another message of some sort, I wouldn't even reply until the next day. I didn't just have the wisdom to do this right away. I kind of had to suffer through this unbelievable flood of messages before I started to realize that one of the ways my ex was getting satisfaction out of it wasn't even the responses that I was providing. It was just the fact that I had to respond. She had it in her head that every time she sent a message, I had to respond. And so she would just sit there obsessing over this idea in her head that I had to respond, and she would just send message after message after message. I think one day there was like 33 messages alone. And I started to realize that every time I responded, I'd just get another one. And I won't go into the contents of those yet, because that's going to be something I cover later on in the video. But it was one of the first, well, not even one of the first things I realized, but one of the most important things that I realized is by responding to every message immediately, I was actually creating this fuel that she was using to send even more messages. By not responding and waiting 7 hours and responding to a big blob of them, and then waiting a whole entire day, she would send less messages. She wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. I was able to go about my day and have a good day with my son, and she wasn't sort of just constantly there absorbing all of my attention by sending messages nonstop. Once she started to see the pattern that I was responding just once a day, she kind of just stopped doing that. There's not a whole lot that they can tell a judge, because if you tell a judge, you know, Your Honor, he was only responding to my messages once a day, the judge is going to say, what's wrong with that? That's every day. So there's not much they can do in that sense. The exception to this would obviously be time-sensitive issues. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on exceptions, because then the video will get crazy long. But there were times in my case and in other people's cases where they would exploit the fact that they could create a time-sensitive issue just out of thin air. So, for example, in one of my viewers' cases, the ex would send messages like, do you want to get the child now? Well, of course I do. It's my time for pickup. Well, where do you want to get it? Well, in my house. Well, I'm not going to your house. You know I'm scared of going to your house. You have to pick another place. So because it's time sensitive, because if you don't respond quickly enough, you won't get the child. They'll say, oh, you didn't reply, so I didn't take the child to you, and justify or be able to get out of a contempt of court motion. You're sort of forced to. The time sensitive issues are exceptions, and it's frustrating, but the high conflict acts will exploit situations where they can, where like when they have the child or other situation they have to do with time sensitive issues, maybe like a hospital, an emergency room or something like that. Things like that will be exploited. There's nothing you can do. You're just going to have to respond to those, and because it'll just be used against you if you don't respond on time. Types of communication, I tended to have a sort of tiered idea in my head. So face-to-face, I would never engage in. If my ex ever said something to me face-to-face, and she did try, I would just respond, I'll reply to you in Family Wizard. And there were a few times, even in front of other people, like at the school, she'd create a scene and say, are you going to answer me? Where, you know, this, and this, in front of all these people, thinking that I would just, you know, chicken out and just start talking to her then and there. And I would just turn around and just walk off, and I would send her an Our Family Wizard message, and just responding to whatever she tried to say in person. Text messages, I would only respond to if it was time sensitive. So something like late to an exchange, something that just had to be seen then and there because it made sense. Anything else, she would try to send other kinds of nonsense by text message, and I would just reply in Our Family Wizard saying, I got your text on this date and time, here's my response. She hated it, but over time, she started to use Our Family Wizard at least a little bit. If you've seen my video on Our Family Wizard, you'll see that in the end, my ex just gave up and stopped using it entirely, and then ended up costing her legal custody of the child, of our child. So Our Family Wizard was my #1 mechanism for communication. And before I had Our Family Wizard, it was email. And then I would use text messages for time-sensitive issues only. And I would refrain from all phone calls. There were some occasions where she would leave me a voicemail. I would just respond in Our Family Wizard. Um, I can't think of any situation where I called her. So maybe if like our son died or something, I would call her. But I can't imagine finding any reason, because what they're trying to do is find a way to communicate with you that they can sort of create a narrative for, and they can't do that when they communicate in writing, because you can just attach it to a court to an exhibit. You can just attach it as an exhibit to a motion, and the court will just read the message and understand what it is. When they communicate verbally, they can sort of spin or twist that around later on when they testify. Oh, well, what I actually said was this. It's easier for them to lie their way out of verbal communications. And so that's one of the reasons why they favor verbal communications. And they'll try to find any reason that they can to use verbal communications. In my opinion, text messages were only really a big thing with her when Our Family Wizard was ordered, because she was really not liking the way Our Family Wizard worked. The fact that it had so many communication tools available, like the calendar and the scheduler and the information bank, and the fact that it would tell me when she opened a message and read it, these things got under her skin. They made it very difficult for her to lie, and so she would try to send text messages. So it wasn't really a huge issue for me before, but it was once Our Family Wizard was ordered. So I went over spacing out the communication responses. I went over emphasizing written communications is a big thing. The next thing is this technique that they use where they pretend that if they write something out in a message, it was true. When you get messages from the ex saying things along the line of, well, or something like, you shouldn't have done, you shouldn't have said, you said, where you can get that the gist of the message isn't to actually get some kind of answer from you, but rather to sort of create a record. It's like they're trying to create a record. Only it's not you admitting anything, and it's not anyone neutral stating what occurred, like in a report. It's them trying to act like they're trying to talk to you, when in reality they're trying to put something in writing because they think that it's going to somehow help them in court. That's the best way I can describe it. It's like they communicate. It's like they're not talking to you, they're talking at you. And they're talking at you in a way that they're just trying to say certain things happen that really didn't. You do want to respond to this message, because in their head they either imagine that by saying it is true, or by saying it and you not replying, that you're admitting it's true. And it could become an issue with some of the more naive judges, some of the more incompetent judges. So what I recommend for these messages is to, as very briefly as you possibly can, deny what it is that they're saying, and try to deny it in a way that doesn't invite an argument. This is so hard to do, because almost any way that you respond, they will perceive as an invitation to an argument. Like they're saying something happened and you're saying it didn't, so then they're like, okay, well now I'm going to prove it to you in my response to your response, and I'm going to go into this long Fidel Castro-like speech as to why I'm right, and they're going to go round and round. It's just crazy how it works. But do the best thing that you can to deny it without adding anything extra to the message that invites an argument or anything like that. If they do respond, which they probably will, at that point you can either ignore any subsequent response, or you can say agree to disagree, or you could just reiterate that you disagree and that you're not going to talk about it anymore, something like that. It's with the first few that come, they get pretty thick-headed about it, and they will say stuff like, you don't have a response. Since you don't have a response, it's true. Stuff they say things like that. It's like they're trying to play on the fact that you're in court. And so since you're in court, they know some kind of like secret legal doctrine that if you don't respond a certain way, that they can use it against you. I've seen stuff like that too. Rest assured that as long as you've done enough to clarify the situation, a judge will probably be understanding of it. It came up in my case on the stand, and the judge was understanding. My ex asked me, she was representing herself at this one hearing, and she asked me, you know, why did I agree to this? And I said, I didn't agree to it. And she said, well, you didn't respond. I said, I responded earlier. And I said this. Well, you didn't respond to my response to your response. And I just stated that I didn't need to. I had already responded. And the court had to explain to her, you know, man, just because he thinks it's pointless or that there's no constructive way to continue the, you know, the conversation doesn't mean that he's admitting you're right. Um, and that was a great judge that I had in my case. So that's how you deal with those. There's also communications where the ex is trying to get you to expose yourself. That's the best way I can describe it. With these communications, they're trying to trigger a response, usually an emotional response. Usually they characterize you as an angry person, an abusive person, and they're trying to poke your buttons or push your buttons, get under your skin. And they have this idea in their head that all they have to do is unmask you. And if they can just send you the right combination of communications, they'll get you to explode, and then they gotcha. I used to deal with these too. It's kind of obvious that they're trying to push your buttons. They'll call you names. They'll say you're a bad parent. Um, they'll mischaracterize events. They'll marginalize you. There's all sorts of ways. But the point is, they're not communicating with you to find something out or to resolve an issue or to clarify a problem. They're communicating with you because they're expecting a specific response. They're trying to engineer evidence. They're trying to create evidence where there is none. It's almost like they're treating you like a sort of like a little experiment, and they just have to figure out what combination of chemicals they have to mix to get the right reaction out of you. It's really weird, but when it comes to those messages, just don't get baited. What I did was I responded to the first one, and I said I'm not going to respond to accusatory phrases or something like I'm not going to respond to accusatory statements now or in the future. And then later on, when she would do it, I would just tell her that I would just refer back to the first message. That goes into my next technique. So one of the things that my ex would do was she and other ones, not just mine, but I've seen others do this too, other high conflict exes, for my other viewers, because I do get messages from my viewers and they ask me, you know, what do you do here? They kind of badger you over and over again. So it would be like a message or a communication saying, I want to do this, or this is important. So usually something that has to do with school or a medical appointment or something like that. And you'd respond, you know, either disagreeing or you'd have some input. And then they'd respond again saying something like, so you're saying, so what you want to do is, it's odd because you stated clearly what it is you want to do, but they send a response telling you what you wanted to do, yet it's not what you said. And these can go on and on. So what I would do to those is I would just put a response stating, I reiterate my message sent on, we'll say June 7th, 1999 at 4:12 p.m. And then she'd respond again saying, what is that supposed to mean? I reiterate my message sent at this date and time. I was doing that a lot towards the end of the communication because I don't even know. Sometimes I wonder if she just forgot. But other times I'm convinced she just wanted to drive me crazy. So anyway, it was just one of the things I was doing towards the very end was just responding with that really quick one-line sentence. I reiterate my response on this date and time. A lot of my messages towards the end were me reiterating what I had already said on a date and time previously. Those messages, after like a good month and a half of that, she just went radio silence. She just could not get through. It was like I had erected the perfect force field of blocking inane communications, and she just gave up. And that's the point at which she just abandoned our son, and I was able to terminate her parental rights for abandonment for 6 months. It's frustrating to have to do a video on this, a video that turns communication into such a game. But the problem is that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, a high conflict ex doesn't communicate because they're trying to clarify ambiguities or resolve arguments. They're not trying to communicate for ordinary reasons. Normal people talk to get answers to problems and work things out. They're not trying to work anything out. They're not trying to talk to get answers. They're trying to do all of the things that I said previously in the video. String you along and keep your attention focused on them all day long. Create situations where there is no record as to what was said so that they can characterize the communication as however they want. Make statements that aren't true, but by making them to you, they think they can sort of show the court that it must be true because they sent the message and it's in writing. Or just flat out trying to get you to say something that they think is true. In their paranoia or in their delusion, they think you are a certain type of person and that they need to get these responses from you. They're not communicating to actually communicate. They use communication as just another tool in their arsenal. I feel like there's a lot more to it than this. And it really is one of those things that over time, if you focus on the principle that you just need to see each communication as an exhibit to emotion, and you just need to think about the fact that you're communicating to protect your child, which means you're communicating to win the custody decisions and to win whatever other issues come up before the court. Because the high conflict X is invariably an X with severe emotional mental health issues and an abuser and a child neglector, and the way that they communicate is not going to be a way that is constructive towards them co-parenting with you or towards them taking care of the child. It's the objectives and the mindset and the goals that the high conflict X has are not centered on the best interest of the child. They're centered on winning the case or getting revenge, or their objectives are in all sorts of other areas aside from that. And you just have to see it. It's a sad realization to come to. And I talk about this in the video, failing to agree. But ultimately, cases with high conflict X's who have severe personality disorders and mental health issues devolve to this level. Either they trigger enough responses in their victim that the victim inadvertently portrays themselves as an unstable person, or an unreliable parent, or worse yet, a stalker or abuser, or either that happens and sadly the child ends up with the high conflict X and gets abused into oblivion, or you get your stuff together, you figure out that this is the way it has to be, and you focus on the fact that the solution is going to come from the court system, because the only alternative is to play outside of the court system, and that is the playpen of the abuser, because they have no shame, their shame knows no bounds, they have no conscience, they don't put themselves in your shoes, they don't lose an ounce of sleep over what they're doing to you and the child, and ultimately a lot of them are sadistic. So it's not even that they just are ambivalent towards the suffering of the child and you. A lot of them actually get off on it. It's really disturbing. But I've seen enough people send me messages, and I've gotten enough questions, both in my inbox and in the comments, that I decided to go ahead and do this video. Please post in the comments below if you have any questions, because I'm sure that I haven't covered everything. This is one of the most difficult things to really figure out for me. It took me 5 years to really figure out that this was something that I needed to focus on in my case, and it took me 3 years. Well, it took me about 1 year to really perfect it, and I had to stay consistent for a total of 3 years. Last piece of advice is watch the video anticipating the response, because in that video I tell people to put yourself in your ex's mindset and figure out what they could use to exploit you. And when you figure out what those things are, if possible, include them in your include ways to cut those things off in your communications to your ex. One small example here is, let's say the ex sends a communication saying, hey, I'm in town, I want to see the child at 5 p.m. You may have a court order that says they have to give you 2 weeks notice, But at the same time, you may think to yourself, they haven't seen the child in 4 months. I just got permission to relocate. I could say you're not following the court order so you can't see him, but I know that they're going to say that I'm a bad parent and I don't want them to see the child. So what I'm going to do in my response is, you need to follow the court order. You need to give me 2 weeks notice. But this one time I will allow it. Just don't do it again. Things like that. When you respond, follow all the principles in my video, but also watch the video anticipating the response. And before you hit that send button, think to yourself, is there a way that they could use this? And if you do identify a few ways, think, is there a way that I can sort of cut that off, that I can sort of block them from doing that by adding maybe a specific sentence or phrase in this? It's not always going to be possible, but sometimes, and again, I wish I had examples, but like I said, I don't want to share people's messages and communications on my channel. I know examples are the best way to learn. What I would recommend, if anyone is really struggling, is go ahead and send me an email. I can't really help people with all their messages all the time because it would just be so many I wouldn't have any spare time. But if you have a tricky situation or you're trying to figure out how to do this, feel free to send me a message, and if I have enough time and it's not a really long message, I'll be able to sort of help you with the fashion a response or whatever. The last thing I want to say is, make sure you are as dispassionate as possible, as ambivalent as possible, as emotionless as possible, and as brief as possible in all of your communications. Keep them as short as possible and as emotionless and as dispassionate as possible, because it seems that with these high conflict exes, they want to see emotion. They want to see that they're getting under your skin. They want to be called names. They want you to yell and scream at them. I talk about this in the video, Fighting Fire with Fire. They want to pull you down to their level. They want to wrestle in the mud with you. So just try and keep it as factual as possible, short as possible, emotionless as possible, and dispassionate as possible. That is a golden rule for all of the communications. If you think that a high conflict ex is going to have some coming to light moment or an epiphany based on you calling them out, or going into a tirade about how completely unreasonable they're being, no, they're just going to get worse, because that's what they wanted. That's what they're thirsty for. And when you give it to them, they just want, it's like a drug. They're junkies. That's the best way to describe them. Anyway, with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this video, and I will see you guys next time.